Creepypastas and Me, written and read by Matthew Yardies. Down the road I stroll, the sound of my footsteps on the rough pavement and the frigid wind are my only company. Oftentimes when I go for a walk, I would have my headphones in, neatly placed on top of my head, a stray wire that leads from my head to my pocket where my phone lay. But in order to actually listen to anything, I would have to use my phone's data, which is expensive. For the longest time, I would listen to a playlist of songs I'd downloaded beforehand. Unfortunately, over the course of several trips, I managed to listen to every single song multiple times over. It got boring listening to Rip and Tear from the Doom 2016 game while walking down the street, only to get bewildered looks from anybody who comes my way. I park myself against the wall of the local ice cream shop, where a tall bus stop sign stands on the curb across from me. Joining me at this bus stop are a few bored-looking people, staring impatiently on either side of the road. The bus wouldn't arrive for a good 15 minutes or so. I glance down lazily at my phone. Begrudgingly, I open the music app, only to meet my tired, overplayed friend, Mateo's playlist. Do I really want to listen to all these again? I ponder as I scroll further down the page. At the very bottom of the page, I find a large and rather old playlist I hadn't opened since 2013. Creepypasta readings. Very spoopy. A wave of nostalgia washes over me as I open the playlist of these so-called spoopy stories. I think I owe you a quick explanation to what the hell a creepypasta is. The word itself is derived from the words copy-paste, as people would copy their pre-written stories, then paste them onto the internet for other people to read. Eventually, they were dubbed creepypastas, as most of these copy-pastes were strictly horror-themed, scary and unusual stories that young, inexperienced writers would share. Then YouTubers would find these stories, then read them and or review them on their channels. I loved listening to these so much, so I downloaded an absolute truckload of them onto my phone. I got brief, long flashes of moments from each story as I read their titles. Moaning Blue, Ben Drowned, Ballad of the Damned, The Day I Started, It Wasn't Lavender Town, Eevee in the Burnt Tower, Pokemon Death Snap, Buried Alive, NES Godzilla, Easter Egg, Snow on Mount Silver, Sonic.Exe, Killer Zubat Cave, Thank You for Playing, Rayman, Run 63, Pokemon Fire Rapidash, Showers, The Russian Sleep Experiment, Do It, Pokemon Blood Edition, Bones, Curse of the Daycare Man, Diamond in the Rough, Strangled Red, Mr. Mix, Misfortune.gb, Pack Rat, Lost Silver, Bam, Wasted, Jessica, and Disabled. Several long-forgotten memories began to reawaken in my mind as I continued to explore this ancient treasure trove of spooky tales. However, since it's such a huge collection, a good chunk of them I had completely forgotten about. But I do remember a lot of them either being brilliant, awful, hilariously awful, bad, pretentious, mediocre, boring, terrifying, disappointing, illiterate, gratuitous, unsettling, and, funnily enough, creepy. When anybody with a computer could upload a story, it's no surprise that the overall quality of these stories is inconsistent. But no matter how good or bad they are, I always enjoy listening to them. I will admit, however, that I wasn't too invested in the voice reading these stories, Mr. Bread, especially in his earliest recordings, as his voice was quite nasally. But nowadays, I have a deeper appreciation for his constant dedication to his craft, and strong criticism of the story at the end of each reading. Perhaps nostalgia also plays a big part in all this. Despite their namesake, I oddly find them comforting. It gives me insight to how dark life can be for a lot of people, and it makes me grateful and more aware about the fear, neglect, and anxiety other people must endure, in spite of the nonsensical and almost fantastical nature of these stories. But I will admit there have been times where at least one of these stories had actually terrified me. I owe that accomplishment to a story called Ben Drowned, a story about a college student who buys a haunted version of the game The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask for the Nintendo 64. Over the course of several days, he's tormented by a spirit called Ben that resides within the game cartridge, and on paper, this premise sounds quite absurd and overdramatic, but in execution, the writing excels at displaying the anxiety of our young main character, as this game worms its way into his mind. The mystery about who Ben is and how he died. The title leads us to believe that he drowned, but that's all we have to go off of. After the main character's first playthrough of the game, the main character feels obligated to return to the old man who sold the game in the first place. Upon arriving, he's nowhere to be found, but after asking one of the neighbours about the old man and about Ben, the neighbour mentions briefly that there was an incident about a boy called Ben, who may or may not have owned the game in the first place, but he never elaborated. If you're reading it online, there are also links to videos accompanying each one of the entries. In these videos, it displays the haunted gameplay footage described in each entry. It's also revealed later on in the story that Ben has subtly manipulated some of the posts and produced his own version of events. I know this because there's an entry from the perspective of one of the author's roommates, but the author mentions near the end of the story that he regrets selecting a single dorm. This is evidence that the author never had a roommate in the first place. The whole setup reminds me of how Bram Stoker's Dracula was written. I'd highly recommend you give this one a listen, or seek out the original story yourself if you want to get into creepypasta. Unfortunately, most video game based creepypastas will go on to copy Ben Drowned's blueprint, finding a haunted version of a beloved game, creepy things happen, and the author either destroys the game or dies by the end. Enter Sonic.Exe. Despite his popularity with the younger crowd, this story has always been atrocious, as our main character finds a haunted version of a video game they really like, in this case Sonic the Hedgehog, and creepy things ensue. That being, Sonic now has black eyeballs with red pupils, and tortures and murders all of his friends as the main character plays with the game. The idea of a hero like Sonic turning evil could have been a fascinating concept, but the execution is sloppy and gratuitous, as we're not given any explanation for Sonic's transformation or his new motivations. Unlike Ben Drowned, where the author's anxiety is believable and identifiable, Sonic.Exe's offer is overly dramatic and it sucks out any sympathy we can have for him. Even when we get stories like this, I believe they can provide a solid learning experience for anybody who wants to get into writing stories, not just horror. As a matter of fact, all of these stories inspired me to get into writing. I still have ways to go in developing my plots and my writing style, however. In the corner of my eye, I spot the bus, trundling towards the stop. On the spot, I select Sonic.Exe. Mr. Bread's familiar voice announces the title as I wordlessly pay my fare and sit down. I glance out the window, and the journey fades away in the haze of hyper-realistic blood.